There is a moment in history when power feels absolute, not because it is moral, not because it is just, but because it appears unquestionable. In those moments, leaders stop asking whether something should be done and start asking only whether it can be done. And when power reaches that stage, it almost always makes the same mistake. It overplays its hand. In February of 2022, the United States and its allies believed they were exercising the ultimate form of financial power. No bombs, no troops, no invasion, just a switch, a network, a decision made in conference rooms, not on battlefields. They believed they had discovered a weapon so precise, so overwhelming, that resistance would be impossible. Russia would be isolated. Its economy would collapse. Its currency would become worthless. Its government would fold under pressure. The world watched. Markets panicked. Experts celebrated. Headlines declared victory before the war had even settled into its second week. But something far more important than Russia was set in motion that week. Something quieter, slower, and far more dangerous to American power than any foreign army. Because for the first time in modern history, the world saw, unmistakably, that money itself had become a weapon. And once money becomes a weapon, it stops being neutral. When neutrality disappears, trust follows. And when trust leaves a financial system, that system does not collapse overnight. It erodes, silently, relentlessly, until one day people wake up and realize the foundation is gone. This story is not about Russia. It is about what happens to empires when they weaponize the very systems that made them powerful. And it has happened before, not once, not twice, but every single time a dominant power confused control with permanence. To understand why February 2022 may one day be remembered as the beginning of the end of dollar dominance, you must first understand what was actually used as a weapon. Because it wasn't just sanctions, it wasn't just frozen assets, it was the financial nervous system of the modern world. SWIFT. Most people think SWIFT is a bank. It isn't. SWIFT does not hold money. It does not lend money. It does not move money. SWIFT is something far more subtle and far more powerful. It is the language global finance speaks. Every day, banks across the world send messages to one another confirming payments, settlements, and obligations. Those messages must be standardized, trusted, and secure. Without that communication, modern international trade grinds to a halt. SWIFT is that communication layer. Over 11,000 financial institutions in more than 200 countries rely on it. Trillions of dollars in transactions flow through its messaging system every single day. Take SWIFT away, and a country doesn't just lose convenience. It loses access to global commerce. For decades, SWIFT was treated as politically neutral infrastructure. Like undersea cables or air traffic control, it existed above geopolitics, not inside it. That illusion ended long before 2022. But in 2022, it ended publicly. When Russian banks were disconnected from SWIFT, the message sent to the world was clear. Access to the global financial system is conditional. Conditional on alignment. Conditional on compliance. Conditional on remaining on the right side of Western power. That realization landed far beyond Moscow. It landed in Beijing, in Riyadh, in New Delhi, in Brasilia, in Ankara, in every central bank where reserves were held, not in vaults, but as numbers on screens in New York, London, and Brussels. And it forced a question that had been unthinkable just a decade earlier. If this can be done to Russia, why not to us? To understand why this question matters so deeply, we need to talk about the privilege that defines American power in the modern world. The dollar. For over 70 years, the US dollar has been more than a national currency. It has been the foundation of global trade, global reserves, and global trust. Oil is priced in dollars. Debt is issued in dollars. Reserves are stored in dollars. This creates an extraordinary advantage. The United States can run deficits that would crush any other nation. It can borrow cheaply, endlessly, because the world needs dollars. It can import far more than it exports and pay with its own currency. This is not normal. It is the privilege of empire, and like all imperial privileges, it rests on a single fragile pillar. Confidence. Confidence that the system is stable. Confidence that rules apply universally. Confidence that money stored today will still be usable tomorrow. The moment money becomes a weapon, confidence begins to crack. History is brutally consistent on this point. Every dominant financial power that turned its monetary system into a tool of coercion eventually lost its dominance. Not immediately, but inevitably. The British Empire learned this lesson the hard way. At the dawn of the 20th century, Britain was the financial center of the world. London was the beating heart of global finance. The pound sterling was the reserve currency. British banks cleared international trade. British capital financed global growth. Then came World War I. In 1914, Britain made a fateful decision. It froze German assets, seized property, and weaponized its control over international finance to punish an enemy. At the time, it seemed logical. Germany would be weakened. British power would be reinforced. Neutral countries would fall in line. Instead, neutral countries learned a lesson Britain never intended to teach. Their assets in London were not safe. If Britain could seize German wealth during war, it could seize anyone's wealth during conflict. From that moment on, countries began to diversify. They moved reserves, they accumulated gold, they opened accounts elsewhere. Slowly, quietly, the financial gravity of the world shifted. By the end of World War II, the pound had lost its dominance. The dollar replaced it. Not because America defeated Britain militarily, but because Britain undermined trust in its own system. This pattern repeated itself again in the late 20th century. In 1979, after the Iranian hostage crisis, the United States froze Iranian assets held in American banks. It worked, tactically. The hostages were released, but strategically, something changed. For the first time, countries realized that dollar reserves could be frozen by executive order. Sovereign wealth was no longer sovereign if it lived inside another country's financial system. Oil exporters noticed. Central banks noticed. And once again, diversification began. Not rebellion, not hostility, risk management. That is the key point most people miss. Countries don't abandon dominant systems out of ideology. They abandon them out of fear. Fear of vulnerability, fear of dependence, fear of having their economic future decided by someone else's politics. This brings us back to 2022, when Russian central bank reserves, hundreds of billions of dollars, were frozen overnight. A line was crossed. This wasn't about punishing a small state. This wasn't about enforcing sanctions on a marginal economy. This was a demonstration of power against a major nuclear-armed state. And the world understood the signal. No reserve is untouchable. No account is safe. No system is neutral. The immediate shock was real. The ruble collapsed. Markets panicked. Analysts predicted economic ruin. But then something unexpected happened. Russia adapted. Interest rates were raised aggressively. Capital controls were imposed. Trade routes were rerouted. Payments were redirected through alternative systems. Oil kept flowing, gas kept selling. Trade continued, just not through the channels the West controlled. Within months, the ruble recovered. Within a year, the economy stabilized. This does not mean sanctions failed entirely. They hurt, they constrained, they reshaped incentives. But they did something far more consequential. They proved that survival outside the dollar SWIFT system was possible. That proof mattered more than any GDP statistic, because once one major country demonstrates survivability, others begin planning, not to rebel, but to prepare. China accelerated its alternative payment infrastructure. India expanded rupee-based trade settlements. Middle Eastern states explored non-dollar energy sales. Central banks bought gold at the fastest pace in decades. None of this happened overnight, but none of it was accidental. This is the beginning of a shift most Americans are barely aware of. Not because it is secret, but because it unfolds slowly, without drama. Empires rarely fall in moments of explosion. They fade through miscalculation. And the greatest miscalculation an empire can make is to believe that dominance today guarantees relevance tomorrow. The decision to weaponize SWIFT and the dollar was not irrational. It was understandable. It felt powerful. It felt clean. It felt decisive. But power that relies on fear rather than trust always carries a hidden cost. And that cost compounds. In the next part, we will break down the exact historical pattern that repeats every time a financial system is militarized. 5 stages. No exceptions, no deviations. And once you see the pattern, you will understand why what began as a sanction against Russia may ultimately reshape the global financial order and America's place within it. To understand what is happening now, you need to step back from headlines and emotions and look at history the way strategists do. Not as isolated events, not as moral judgments, but as patterns. Because when it comes to money, power, and trust, history is brutally repetitive. Across the last century, dominant financial powers have followed the same trajectory again and again. Different flags, different currencies, different enemies. But the structure never changes. There are 5 stages. Every empire that weaponized finance passed through them. Every empire believed it was the exception. None of them were. The first stage is control. Before finance can be weaponized, it must be centralized. Control does not mean ownership in a legal sense. It means influence so deep that alternatives feel unnecessary. Before 1914, Britain controlled global finance not because it owned every bank, but because London was indispensable. Trade cleared there. Insurance was written there. Capital flowed through British institutions because they were trusted, liquid, and dominant. After World War II, the United States inherited this role. The dollar became the anchor of global trade. The IMF and World Bank institutionalized dollar primacy. Energy markets were dollar-based. U.S. Treasury bonds became the world's safest asset. By the early 21st century, there was no serious alternative. Not because alternatives were illegal, but because they were inefficient. Why settle trade in obscure currencies when the dollar was liquid, stable, and universally accepted? Why build parallel systems when SWIFT already worked? This is what true dominance looks like. The system becomes invisible. People stop noticing it, stop questioning it, stop imagining life without it. That is when stage 2 begins. Militarization. At first, it is subtle. Financial tools are used to fight terrorism, then rogue states, then regional adversaries. Each time, the justification feels moral. After September 11th, the United States aggressively targeted terrorist financing. Few objected. Freezing accounts linked to Al-Qaeda was not controversial. Then came Iran, North Korea, Venezuela. Sanctions expanded. Financial pressure became normalized. Each step made the next easier. By the time Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, the idea of using SWIFT and reserve freezes felt obvious. Why wouldn't you? If you control the system, why not use it? This is the trap. Because every time financial power is used coercively, the system teaches the world something new. It teaches them where the weak points are. That leads to stage 3. Adaptation by the target. Russia did not improvise after 2022. It executed plans that had been quietly prepared for years. After the 2014 Crimea sanctions, Russian policymakers reached a clear conclusion. Dollar dependence was a strategic vulnerability. They acted accordingly. They reduced U.S. Treasury holdings dramatically. They increased gold reserves. They built their own financial messaging system. They negotiated currency swap agreements. These moves were dismissed in Western media as symbolic or ineffective. They were neither. They were slow, they were inefficient, they were expensive. But they worked. When SWIFT access was restricted, Russia already had alternatives, not perfect ones, but sufficient ones. Trade with China moved to yuan and rubles. Trade with India moved to rupees. Energy sales were rerouted through intermediaries and new logistics chains. This is a crucial point. Alternatives do not need to be better than the dominant system. They only need to be good enough. The moment good enough exists, dominance weakens, which brings us to the most dangerous stage for the dominant power. Stage 4. Neutral countries hedge. This is where real decline begins, not because enemies rebel, but because friends prepare. After 2022, no serious government could claim ignorance. They had watched hundreds of billions in reserves frozen overnight. They had seen access to global finance revoked by political decision, and they asked themselves a quiet question: what is our exposure? China did not need persuasion. It had already been planning for this moment. For years, Beijing had been reducing its reliance on U.S. treasuries. It expanded the cross-border interbank payment system. It encouraged trade settlement in yuan. It signed swap agreements with dozens of countries. After 2022, these efforts accelerated. But China was not alone. India, officially neutral, began expanding rupee-based trade. Saudi Arabia signaled willingness to accept non-dollar oil payments. The UAE developed regional payment infrastructure. Brazil and Argentina explored currency alternatives for bilateral trade. Even U.S. allies quietly diversified. Japan increased gold reserves. European central banks discussed strategic autonomy. Southeast Asian economies strengthened local currency settlement frameworks. None of this was anti-American. It was rational. This is the part that makes decline invisible from inside the empire. There are no protests, no declarations, no dramatic announcements, just spreadsheets changing, just portfolios adjusting, just risk officers doing their jobs. By the time politicians notice, it is already too late. Because once hedging begins at scale, stage 5 becomes inevitable. The weapon loses power, not all at once, but permanently. Sanctions become less effective. Financial pressure produces diminishing returns. Targets adapt faster each time. And eventually, the system that once enforced compliance becomes just one option among many. This is where the dollar and SWIFT are headed. Not collapse, competition. That distinction matters. The dollar will not disappear. SWIFT will not shut down. But dominance is not binary. It is relative, and relative power is already shifting. The share of global reserves held in dollars has declined steadily for decades. What changed after 2022 was the pace. Diversification accelerated. Gold purchases by central banks reached levels unseen since the collapse of Bretton Woods. Bilateral trade agreements increasingly bypassed the dollar. Alternative payment systems expanded rapidly. Each of these developments reinforces the others. Less dollar usage reduces network effects. Reduced network effects lower switching costs. Lower switching costs encourage further diversification. This is how decline feeds on itself. The most dangerous moment for a dominant power is not when it is challenged. It is when it believes it has no challenger. That belief leads to complacency. Complacency leads to overreach, and overreach teaches the world how to live without you. The United States did not invent this pattern. It inherited it. Like every empire before it, it believed it could manage the risks, that financial weapons could be used surgically, that trust would remain intact, that alternatives would remain inferior. History suggests otherwise. The British pound did not collapse the day Britain froze German assets. It faded over decades. Confidence drained slowly, and by the time Britain realized what it had lost, the system had already moved on. The same process is now underway. Not because America is weak, but because it is powerful. Power always believes it can bend rules without breaking systems. It is almost always wrong. In the next part, we will look closely at the data. Not opinions, not forecasts, but measurable shifts already happening in reserves, trade, and financial infrastructure. Because the most convincing evidence of systemic change is never rhetoric. It is behavior. And global behavior is already changing. If you want to understand whether a global shift is real, you do not listen to speeches. You look at balance sheets. You look at settlement data. You look at what central banks are doing when no one is watching. Because governments lie in public, money tells the truth in private. For decades, the dollar's dominance was so overwhelming that questioning it felt almost absurd. Even critics admitted there was no viable alternative. The system was inefficient at times, unfair at others, but it worked. What changed after 2022 is not ideology. It is behavior. Let's start with reserves. For most of the post-Cold War era, the US dollar accounted for roughly 70% of global foreign exchange reserves. This was not because countries loved America. It was because the dollar was liquid, stable, and universally accepted. That share has been falling slowly since the late 1990s, but after 2022, the decline accelerated. This is not a guess. It is reported by the IMF itself. By 2024, the dollar's share of global reserves had fallen below 60%. That may not sound dramatic until you understand scale. A 10% shift in global reserves represents trillions of dollars. And those trillions did not disappear. They moved. Some went into euros, some into yen, some into smaller currencies. But the most telling destination was gold. Central banks around the world began buying gold at a pace not seen since the 1970s, the exact period when trust in the dollar system last collapsed. Gold has no yield. It pays no interest. It is cumbersome to store, which is precisely why it is chosen in moments like this. Gold cannot be frozen. Gold cannot be sanctioned. Gold does not depend on anyone's permission. When central banks choose gold over treasuries, they are making a statement, even if they never say it out loud. Now look at trade settlement. Before the Russia sanctions, the overwhelming majority of global trade was invoiced and settled in dollars. Even trade between two non-American countries often used the dollar as an intermediary. That is changing. Russia's case is illustrative, not because it is unique, but because it is measurable. Before 2022, nearly all Russian trade was settled in dollars or euros. By 2024, roughly 40% was settled in other currencies. That is not theoretical de-dollarization. That is operational reality. Russian-Chinese trade now flows primarily in yuan and rubles. Russian-Indian trade uses rupees. Russian-Middle Eastern trade increasingly uses local currencies. But again, Russia is not the point. The point is what other countries learned from Russia's experience. If a large economy under extreme sanctions can still trade, still settle payments, still function, then total financial isolation is no longer guaranteed. And when isolation is no longer guaranteed, deterrence weakens. Now consider payment infrastructure. SWIFT remains the largest messaging system in the world. Its absolute volume continues to grow. But relative dominance matters more than raw numbers. China's cross-border interbank payment system has expanded rapidly. It connects thousands of financial institutions across more than 100 countries. India's unified payments interface, originally domestic, is being linked internationally. Regional systems in the Middle East, Southeast Asia, and Latin America are quietly being integrated. None of these systems individually rival SWIFT. Together, they do. This is how monopolies die. Not through a single competitor, but through fragmentation. The same process happened to Britain. When London lost exclusivity, New York did not immediately replace it. Capital spread first. Only later did a new center emerge. Now look at energy. For half a century, the petrodollar system anchored dollar demand. Oil was priced and settled almost exclusively in dollars. Any country that needed energy needed dollars. That monopoly is breaking, not collapsing, breaking. Saudi Arabia has signaled willingness to accept yuan for oil sales to China. Russia sells oil to India in rupees. Iran trades energy with China outside the dollar system. Each deal is small relative to global volume. But systems are not defined by size. They are defined by precedent. Once a rule is broken, it stops being a rule. Now consider currency swap agreements. China has signed swap lines with dozens of countries, allowing trade settlement without touching the dollar. These agreements reduce the need for dollar liquidity during crises. Russia, India, and others have done the same regionally. This creates redundancy. Redundancy is the enemy of dominance. The more pathways exist, the less leverage any single pathway holds. What you are seeing is not the collapse of the dollar. It is the slow erosion of its exclusivity. And exclusivity is what made the dollar powerful. Now let's talk about psychology. Because financial systems are built as much on belief as on mechanics. Before 2022, most countries assumed that sanctions were reserved for extreme cases. They believed neutrality offered protection. They believed that alignment could be managed. The freezing of central bank reserves shattered that assumption. If reserves are no longer sacrosanct, then holding them becomes a risk calculation. And risk calculations change behavior. This is why de-dollarization is accelerating not among enemies, but among cautious pragmatists. Countries that still trade heavily with the United States. Countries that still rely on Western markets. Countries that still value stability. They are not abandoning the dollar. They are reducing exposure. That distinction matters enormously, because the dollar's privilege depends not on total abandonment, but on marginal demand. The US can run massive deficits because foreigners need dollars when they need fewer dollars, even slightly fewer. The math changes. Interest rates rise. Debt becomes more expensive. Fiscal space shrinks. This is not speculation. It is arithmetic. And arithmetic does not care about narratives. The uncomfortable truth is this: the financial weapon used in 2022 worked once. It will never work the same way again. Because now everyone knows it exists. And systems that rely on surprise lose power the moment surprise is gone. This is the paradox of financial coercion. The more effective it appears in the short term, the more damage it does in the long term. Every sanction teaches adaptation. Every freeze teaches diversification. Every exclusion creates an incentive to build alternatives. This is why financial weapons always contain the seeds of their own decline. The United States is not unique in making this mistake. It is simply the latest to do so at scale. The difference today is speed. Technology accelerates adaptation. What took decades in the 20th century now takes years, sometimes months. Digital payment systems scale rapidly. Trade networks reconfigure faster. Information spreads instantly. This compresses timelines. The British pound took 30 years to lose dominance after weaponization. The dollar may not have that long. Not because America is weaker, but because the world is faster. In the next part, we will confront the question most Americans instinctively avoid. What happens to the United States when the dollar is no longer unrivaled? Not apocalypse, not collapse. Something more subtle and more uncomfortable. A return to normality. And for a country built on exceptional privilege, normality feels like decline. When Americans hear discussions about the dollar losing dominance, the reaction is often immediate and emotional. This sounds exaggerated. The dollar has survived worse. There is no alternative. All of these statements are partially true. And that is precisely why this transition is so dangerous. Because decline, when it comes, does not announce itself as collapse. It announces itself as normalization. For most of modern American history, the United States has lived inside an economic reality that no other country enjoys. It consumes more than it produces. It imports more than it exports. It runs permanent deficits, fiscal and trade, without immediate consequence. This is not a moral failure. It is a structural privilege. The world accepts dollars because the world needs dollars. As long as that remains true, the system functions. But dominance does not disappear when a currency stops being used. It disappears when it stops being necessary, and necessity is already eroding. Let's talk about debt, not as a talking point, but as a mechanism. The United States can sustain enormous public debt because global demand for U.S. Treasury bonds remains strong. Foreign governments, central banks, and institutions buy treasuries not out of charity, but because they are liquid, safe, and useful. Treasuries are how the world parks excess dollars. But if fewer dollars are needed globally, fewer treasuries are needed. This is not political. It is mechanical. When demand weakens, interest rates rise. Rising interest rates change everything. They make deficits more expensive. They crowd out domestic investment. They force fiscal choices that have been postponed for decades. This is why reserve currency status matters so deeply. It is not about prestige. It is about math. Now consider inflation. For decades, the United States has effectively exported inflation. When dollars flood global markets, other countries absorb part of the inflationary pressure by holding dollar reserves. If that demand weakens, inflation stays home. This does not mean hyperinflation. It means persistent pressure, 5% instead of 2%, 7% instead of 3%. Over time, that compounds. Wages lag, savings erode. Living standards adjust downward, not dramatically, gradually. This is how populations become confused. Nothing collapses, but nothing feels affordable anymore. This is the lived experience of losing monetary privilege. Now consider military power. The U.S. military is not funded like other militaries. It is funded through debt made cheap by dollar dominance. Aircraft carriers are not paid for upfront. Global bases are not balanced annually. They are financed over time. If borrowing becomes structurally more expensive, global military reach becomes harder to sustain. This does not mean retreat tomorrow. It means trade-offs. And empires hate trade-offs. Now consider trade itself. The United States runs a massive trade deficit, hundreds of billions of dollars annually. This works only because exporters accept dollars. If exporters prefer other currencies, the U.S. must either export more or import less. There is no third option. Exporting more requires rebuilding industrial capacity. Slow and politically painful. Importing less means higher prices and reduced choice. Neither is catastrophic. Both are uncomfortable, and discomfort is what decline feels like from the inside. This is where psychology matters. Americans are not accustomed to thinking of their economy as constrained. Scarcity is something that happens elsewhere, to other countries, other systems. But monetary privilege masks scarcity. When that privilege fades, scarcity reappears, not as crisis, but as friction. Everything costs slightly more. Everything takes slightly longer. Every policy choice feels tighter. This is not failure. It is normalization. Now contrast this with the external perception. From outside the United States, this transition does not look tragic. It looks overdue. For decades, other countries have structured their economies around American consumption, American deficits, and American financial dominance. As that dominance weakens, they gain room to maneuver. This is why the shift away from the dollar is not led by revolutionaries. It is led by planners, central bankers, finance ministries, trade negotiators, people whose job is to reduce vulnerability. And vulnerability is now visible. The freezing of reserves in 2022 was not just a policy decision. It was a demonstration. It demonstrated that financial sovereignty does not exist inside another country's system. Once that truth is understood, behavior changes permanently. No country that has internalized that lesson will ever return to full dependence. Never. This is why financial weapons are unique. You can defeat an army and rebuild it. You can sanction an economy and normalize relations. But once trust in a system is broken, it cannot be restored by rhetoric. Only by time. And time does not favor dominance in a world of alternatives. Now let's address the most common misconception. Many assume that if the dollar weakens, the euro will replace it, or the yen, or some Western alternative. That is unlikely. What is emerging is not replacement. It is fragmentation. A multipolar monetary world. In such a world, no single currency enjoys overwhelming dominance. Trade settles in multiple currencies. Reserves are diversified. Payment systems overlap. This world is less efficient, but it is more resilient. And resilience matters more than efficiency when trust is low. This is why China benefits from the transition, even if it never becomes fully dominant. China does not need to replace the dollar. It only needs to reduce dependence on it. Every percentage point of diversification weakens American leverage and strengthens Chinese autonomy. The same is true for India, for the Gulf states, for emerging economies tired of choosing sides. This is not an ideological shift, it is a strategic one. And strategy operates on timelines longer than election cycles. The tragedy, if it can be called that, is that none of this required hostility. The United States could have maintained dominance by preserving neutrality in financial infrastructure, by treating systems like SWIFT as global commons rather than instruments of power. But once a tool is weaponized, it ceases to be infrastructure. It becomes leverage, and leverage invites resistance. This is the paradox at the heart of American financial policy. The United States believed it was maximizing power. In reality, it was converting soft power into hard coercion, and hard coercion ages badly. Now ask yourself a simple question. If you were a finance minister in a neutral country, not hostile to America, but not subordinate either, what would you do after 2022? Would you keep all reserves in dollars? Would you rely entirely on SWIFT? Would you assume permanent access, or would you quietly diversify? That question answers itself. This is why decline is already underway, even if most Americans cannot yet feel it. The system is still strong. The dollar is still dominant, but dominance is no longer unquestioned. And once questioning begins, the end is not a matter of if, only when. In the final part, we will step back and look at the full arc. Why financial weapons always fail. Why this pattern never breaks. And how, decades from now, historians are likely to look back at February 2022, not as a moment of strength, but as the moment the foundations quietly shifted. Every empire believes it is different. Smarter than its predecessors, more adaptable, less arrogant. History is merciless on this point. Empires do not fall because they are evil. They fall because they misunderstand the source of their power. Military strength feels decisive. Economic size feels permanent. Technological leadership feels unassailable. But beneath all of it lies something far more fragile. Trust. The Roman Empire debased its currency to fund expansion. The Spanish Empire flooded Europe with silver and triggered inflation. The British Empire weaponized finance and lost monetary leadership. None of these empires intended to destroy their own systems. They were responding rationally to immediate pressures. That is what makes the pattern so dangerous. Because decline does not begin with madness. It begins with logic. In February 2022, the United States and its allies made a decision that felt logical, restrained, and morally justified. They froze reserves. They cut access. They used financial dominance instead of military force. From a short-term perspective, it was elegant. From a historical perspective, it was irreversible. Because financial systems are unlike armies. They are not defeated by force. They are abandoned. Once abandonment begins, no decree can stop it. This is the central lesson of financial history. Power based on trust must be exercised with restraint, or it dissolves. The swift decision crossed a psychological boundary. It told the world that global finance was no longer neutral infrastructure. It was geopolitical terrain. Once that realization spread, the response was inevitable. Not rebellion, not alignment shifts. Preparation. And preparation is invisible until it is complete. Historians rarely mark the beginning of decline at the moment it occurs. They recognize it later, when the consequences are obvious. In hindsight, February 2022 will likely be remembered not as the peak of American financial power, but as the moment its limits were exposed. Not because the United States suddenly became weak, but because the world learned it had options. This is what makes the transition so unsettling. There is no single event to point to, no dramatic collapse, no obvious villain, just a steady redistribution of trust. And trust, once redistributed, does not return easily. The dollar will remain important for decades. SWIFT will continue to function. American power will persist. But hegemony is not about persistence. It is about exclusivity. And exclusivity has already been broken. A multipolar financial world is emerging, not because anyone voted for it, not because anyone announced it, but because risk managers, central bankers, and trade officials quietly decided that dependence was no longer acceptable. This world will be messier, less efficient, more fragmented, but it will also be less controllable, and that is the price of using systems as weapons. The great irony is this. The United States did not lose financial dominance to China through defeat. It taught China, and dozens of others, how to live without American dominance. No invasion was required. No confrontation was necessary. The system hollowed itself out. This does not mean the future is bleak. It means it is different. America will remain wealthy, innovative, influential, but it will no longer be able to externalize every cost. And that adjustment, not collapse, is what defines the end of empire. If there is a lesson here, it is not ideological, it is structural. Power that relies on systems must protect those systems above all else. The moment a system becomes a weapon, it stops being universal. And the moment it stops being universal, it starts to fade. 20 years from now, students of history may look back and ask a simple question. Why did the most powerful financial system in history undermine its own foundations? The answer will not be malice. It will be certainty. Certainty that dominance was permanent. Certainty that alternatives would remain inferior. Certainty that trust could be taken for granted. Empires never fall because they lack power. They fall because they misunderstand it. And if you've watched this far, you already understand something most people don't. You understand that the real shifts shaping the future don't announce themselves loudly. They unfold quietly, in ledgers, in settlement systems, in reserve portfolios. If this analysis gave you a framework you hadn't seen before, if it helped you connect history, finance, and geopolitics into a single pattern, then you already know why conversations like this matter. They sharpen perception, they replace headlines with structure, and they help us see the world as it is becoming, not as it used to be. If you found this perspective valuable, the most meaningful way to support work like this isn't impulsive. It's intentional. A thoughtful comment tells the algorithm and the creator that depth still matters. A like helps this analysis reach people who are quietly searching for context, not outrage. And if there's one person you trust enough to challenge you, one person you genuinely want to discuss this with, sending them this video may lead to a conversation worth having. That, more than anything, is how ideas survive. Not through noise, but through minds willing to think.